Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located. On behalf of everyone here at SCS Global Services, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Benefits of Preparing Carbon Footprints. I'd like to take a minute to update everyone on how we're going to be functioning here in GoToWebinar. And I would like to introduce myself. My name is Karen Righthand, and I'll be your host today. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Marketing here at SCS. To avoid any unnecessary background noises during the presentation, all attendees have been muted, and this will remain a one-way presentation for the duration of our webinar. But if you'd like to ask a question, please go to the questions section in the control panel on your webinar console, type in your question and hit send, and your question will be sent to our panel for review. Be sure to ask your question when you're thinking about it. No need to wait until the end. Depending on the time allotted at the end of the presentation, we'll make every effort to answer all questions submitted. Any questions that we're unable to answer, we will respond afterwards from a member of the panel. And I do want to tell you that today's presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out after the presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Alon McAdam-Somer. He's a technical manager on our LCA team, and Kelly McGarry, who is a research and development associate with our advanced technical services. Just a few words I want to talk about just SCS Global Services in case you're unfamiliar with us. We are now celebrating 40 years in business this year. It's very exciting. We've done over 30,000 certifications in 125 countries around the world. We've worked with 15,000 clients, corporate and government NGOs. We are also having auditors in every market. This is our institutional network. We have expanded to have a consulting division, which is fully independent and firewalled off from our certification business. We have a standards development organization, and we've just launched something called the Global Heat Reduction Initiative. It's very exciting to look at full climate accounting, not just CO2. We basically have certification programs in every sector of the economy for industries all over the world. These are just, and I don't expect anyone to read these, but just giving you an idea of the many different certifications and sectors of the economy that we work in. And this is a map of where we have staff around the world. So let's get right into our topic for today. And I'd like to set the table by saying, why do I need carbon footprints for my products? And there are many reasons, and these are just some of them. Informing the implementation of environmental decisions for projects or policies within your organization. Prioritizing environmental impact reduction efforts where you see greater carbon intensities in some of your products. Moving forward to make a carbon neutrality claim. Obviously, you can't, offset what you haven't measured. Tracking your emissions over time. Sharing your carbon footprint reports with different interested stakeholders, such as your customers, your investors, and then also there is a very heavily evolving regulatory landscape where the reporting on carbon is becoming increasingly important. So these are just some of the reasons that you're going to need to know what the footprints of your products are. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Alon, who's going to take you through the process of developing a product carbon footprint, some of the specifics. And please remember, we are recording, and if you have a question, please type it into the doc. Alon?
All right, thank you so much, Karen. So, as you may or may not know, there are a variety of standards out there for your carbon footprint. And when our team starts to scope your carbon footprint and figure out how we're going to approach your project, the very first thing we're going to do is determine which standard that exists is going to be the best fit for you. And these are three of the major players that we see out there: ISO 14067, the GHG protocol, and PAS 2050. Now, I'll say that ISO 14067 and the GHG protocol are by and far the two more popular standards that we see. And here at our organization, we tend to use ISO 14067 the most, just because we really like the way the standard's written and set up. But we have experience using all three standards, and we've used additional ones that we're not mentioning here. So once we've picked out your standard, the next thing we're going to do is determine what the system boundary is for your product. And the system boundary is going to be cradle to gate or cradle to grave, and it could be something in between depending on the standard that we're using. ISO 14067 does allow for some flexibility in between these two categories. And what is cradle to gate? Cradle to gate is going to be everything required to manufacture your product up until it's manufactured. So that gate is your manufacturing gate. Cradle to grave is going to be all the way to the end of your product's lifetime. So that could include distribution, installation, use, and how it's treated at its end of life. Now, to determine which of these is your best fit, we're going to be looking at, does your product use energy, water, or other resources during its use? Are carbon removal something that's relevant during the use phase or another phase of your product? And are there potentially large impacts from the transport during distribution or the waste treatment at end of life? And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then it might make much more sense or be required by the standard to include these additional life cycle stages going all the way to cradle to grave. So once we've determined your system boundary, next we're going to look for additional standards that are going to help inform your study. So the first thing we'll check is to see if there's a viable product category rule that conforms to the standard that we'll be using. And a product category rule is an additional type of standard that was developed by carbon footprint and life cycle assessment practitioners in cooperation with industry, sometimes governments involved, NGOs can often be involved too. And these stakeholder groups get together and they produce a standard in addition to these other large carbon footprint standards that provide additional guidance on how to do the modeling, the methodology for certain categories of products. If that doesn't exist, we're going to look for another well-recognized standard for this type of product. And if that's not around, we'll look for a guidance document. That could be a product category rule that exists for the product, but doesn't conform to the carbon footprint standard like ISO 14067 that we'll be using. We'll still use it for guidance to help inform assumptions that we might need to make, and we'll document that in the report. And of course, it goes without saying that we're going to have a deep understanding of your product, your manufacturing process, the number of facilities involved, and the complexity of the supply chain. Next slide. Great, so once the scoping process is done, we're ready to begin your product carbon footprint. What does that look like? On a typical product carbon footprint, we're gonna have two members of our team working with you. We'll have a project manager who is gonna be a more experienced expert who will help answer any technical questions, who's gonna handle client relations. And we're also gonna have a very experienced technical lead whose job is really to conduct the technical work, to validate the data, things like that. It'll begin with a kickoff meeting where we're going to introduce our team and your team. We'll go over your product again and make sure we have a really good understanding of it. And we're going to go through our data collection process, which I'll discuss a bit more on our next slide. We'll answer any questions you have. We'll schedule a regular check-in. Typically, we find that meeting once every 2 weeks is a pretty good cadence, but we're always available by email and can schedule additional meetings as needed. The next slide. So the very first step, once we've kicked it off, is data collection, of course. And we use a customized Excel-based data request form. We call it a DRF for short, and we customize it for your project. So in our kickoff meeting, we're gonna go through this DRF form with you, and we're gonna see if there are any parts of that form that need to be modified to better fit your product. For example, if during your manufacturing process you don't use any water or there aren't any additional air emissions, we might remove those portions. If we need to modify something else, changing units that we're asking for, things like that, we're happy to do so. And the type of data that we'll be collecting within this DRF is going to be all of the inputs and outputs involved within the life cycle of your product. So that includes raw materials, scrap loss of those raw materials during the manufacturing process, what the recycled content is of those raw materials is very important for us to know and could affect your impact. The transport of those raw materials to your manufacturing facilities, and then of course the manufacturing itself, whether it's using energy, water, generating waste. If we're doing additional life cycle stages past that cradle to manufacturing gate, then we'll also be collecting information on distribution, installation, use, and end of life. Now, some of these data points we are going to require primary data for, but we don't expect you to have data on every single piece of this. And so we're going to use these additional standards like product category rules, or we'll conduct our own research to fill in data gaps where they are. A good example of this might be in distribution. Sometimes our clients don't have a great idea of their distribution network, and we can use, let's say if we're doing a study in the US, a US EPA census study on distribution, and we can make a good documented assumption on your distribution based on the material type. We can do similar things for end of life, and we can fill in gaps here and there throughout. And once again, things like the type of materials going into your product, your manufacturing energy requirements, those are key points that we'd like to have primary data for. But if those aren't available, we can have a conversation and see if we can still accommodate you. Now, this data collection process also includes validation. So we're going to be checking for submission errors. Sometimes there's an order of magnitude, a decimal point might be off, a unit conversion error might have occurred. So we'll be looking closely at this, and because we have a very large range of experience, we'll be able to compare internally with previous work that we've done to flag potential outliers. And then of course, we'll follow up with you on any questions we might have on your data points. Next slide. Next comes modeling. Here at SCS, we like to use the OpenLCA software tool paired with the EcoInvent database. Now we can use other databases, but I'll say EcoInvent we use for the vast majority of our work. And the reason we use it is because it is very large and extensive. It has over 20,000 data sets in it, and it has a large range of geographical and technological representatives. So when we're modeling your product, if we need to use any secondary data, we don't just want to have a manufacturing process floating in space. We want to have that matched to the geographical area in which you're operating to make it more accurate, and of course, match the technology as closely as we can. And then both OpenLCA and EcoInvent have a lot of technical support behind them, and they're continually updated. EcoInvent just released its 3.10 version of its database, which came out just a month or so ago. One of the other nice things about OpenLCA is it allows for further customization to better reflect your actual processes. So let's say we don't find a great fit in the EcoInvent database for something we're modeling for you, we can customize and build our own data set within OpenLCA and EcoInvent to better match your product. That might be modifying an electricity grid so that it matches a supplier-specific supply that you're getting, or renewable energy credits, for example. It could be modifying a manufacturing process to better match what's actually happening within your facilities. As I mentioned previously, OpenLCA allows for a large range of database compatibility. So if needed, we can use other databases. And here are just a few common ones. So Federal LCA Commons. There's a whole slew of agricultural focused databases, and then there are also EU specific databases too. So while EcoInvent is the primary one that we use, we have a lot of options if needed. Next slide. Once we've conducted your modeling, we're going to interpret your results and produce a draft report. We like to interpret the results by looking at it through a contribution analysis. We're going to see what life cycle stages and processes contribute the bulk of your impact. This also allows for additional validation. So if something looks higher in its contribution impact than we were expecting, we will double check and make sure that it is accurate. And of course, we're going to include this contribution analysis at a very detailed level in your report, so you have it as well. And so the draft report is, oh, if you can go back one more, Karen, sorry. If not, I can just, oh, thank you. So the draft report, as I mentioned, is going to be based on the standard used. It's going to contain everything required for you to communicate your carbon footprint to an external group. I will mention that external communication outside of your organization does require critical review, which we'll talk about next. But just know that everything you need is going to be in there. And another key point, we are going to put all the proprietary data in an appendix for ease of removal before you communicate to a third party. This makes it simple so you don't have to do any kind of complex redacting within the main body of the report. And the reason we include that proprietary data in the first place is because it's required for the critical review process, which once again I'll talk about here in a second. This draft report is also going to be given to you before we finalize it, so you have an opportunity to review the process description, the inputs, any assumptions we're using, limitations, all those kinds of things. Okay, go ahead, Karen. So I mentioned this critical review. Like I said, it's required for all external communications. If you're just using it within your organization for decision making, for instance, you do not need a critical review, but always a good idea to have one. The critical review is going to be conducted by an independent practitioner, someone that was not involved with the study, and we can do it internally within our own organization with a team member who is not involved, or externally, and that might be based on the communication intention. If you're making a comparative claim with your product carbon footprint, it does require an external critical review. And any revisions that are required during this critical review process, or we're working with the critical reviewer, we'll communicate those changes to you and make sure that we're all on the same page. Next slide. There we go. So once the critical review process is done, if it is occurring, we hand over the final deliverables. And that is going to be this product carbon footprint report. And as I mentioned, it's going to have the carbon impact broken down by life cycle stage with a detailed interpretation section of the results. You'll have the methodology, the assumptions, the limitations. You're going to have this ability to easily share the support with outside groups. And once again, all confidential information will be provided in an appendix, so it's easy for you to remove it before you do that communication. And of course, our team is always here for technical support. So if you have questions about the current scope of work, we're going to answer them for you. And I'll add that even after the project finishes, if you have questions that we can easily answer, we'll be happy to help you out even after the project's done. And of course, more complex questions that are outside the current scope of work or are going to require a lot of additional work once the project's completed might require a work extension. Next slide. So here's a general project timeline, and I'll say that these can fluctuate very widely, and it's going to depend greatly on how quickly you're able to collect data and provide it to us and answer any questions we might have, how quickly you can review the draft report, and then of course the complexity of the project itself. But here are the 4 broad stages that I mentioned. I've already discussed these bullets that are there, and you can see that a more simple standard product carbon footprint could be completed as quickly as 3 months, whereas a more complex one might take somewhere closer to 6 months. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly McGarry, who's going to talk about a very important mechanism that's used in Europe. It's called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So Kelly, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. So on this slide, I will give a brief introduction to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM for short. Producers in the European Union are already subject to the Emissions Trading System, or ETS, which is a cap and trade system where companies must surrender allowances to account for their carbon emissions each year. So each company receives some allowances free and can trade allowances as needed. CBAM has been implemented to prevent carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is where companies move production to a country with less ambitious climate measures, which leads to an overall increase in emissions. Under CBAM, producers outside of the EU will be subject to the same costs for their emissions as EU producers. CBAM currently applies to 6 carbon-intensive sectors, which are cement, aluminum, iron and steel, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. And we are currently in the transitional phase through 2025, where emissions need to be reported, but no tariffs need to be paid. After the transitional phase, the tariff due will depend on the emissions embedded in goods imported to the EU, minus any carbon tax paid in the country of origin. Next slide, please. So to determine the emissions embedded in the imported goods, we need to, as a whole, we need to determine the embedded emissions of each good. And embedded emissions is a term used in CBAM, but in concept, it's similar to a product carbon footprint. It also has a calculation method that's different than a typical product carbon footprint, which I will give some information about now. So like a product carbon footprint, the embedded emissions requires monitoring at the manufacturing site to determine the amount of emissions caused by combustion, industrial processes, and heating and cooling. So we can use the same data that's collected in a typical product carbon footprint to help us determine the embedded emissions for CBAM. One major difference is that the embedded emissions need to be split between two pools, the direct emissions and the indirect emissions, which is shown here on this slide. So the direct emissions are the emissions occurring directly at the manufacturing site, and the indirect emissions come from electricity consumed to produce the goods. To account for material inputs, only goods that are listed as relevant precursors in the CBAM regulation, which are goods themselves that are covered by CBAM, need to be taken account for the material inputs. And the direct emissions of the precursor is added to the direct emissions of the finished product, and the indirect emissions of the precursor is added to the indirect emissions of the finished product. So since we need to know this split between direct and indirect emissions, emission factors or secondary data specific to CBAM need to be used. Default factors for this purpose can be used without limits through the reporting for Q2 of this year. But after that, real data from the supply chain must account for at least 20% of the embedded emissions of goods. Another difference is the life stages that need to be included for CBAM. The transport, use, and end of life stages are not included. And so overall, the calculated embedded emissions of goods produced outside of the EU currently need to be reported by importers during the transitional period, and then eventually those will form the basis for tariffs imposed by CBAM. And that's all I have about CBAM.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Yes, CBAM is emerging as a very important reason for a sort of tailored carbon footprint for any North American companies that are exporting their goods to the EU. I do want to just wrap up. We're going to move on to our questions segment here, but I'm going to show this slide where we have a bunch of different carbon related and related topic webinars coming up, and you don't have to worry about writing these all down because we will have them on our website, and you will probably receive emails about them. So just note that if you're needing to have information about any of these topics, these will be upcoming webinars that we will have. So with that, we can move to questions. And the first question that I have, Elon, I think is for you. If you could say a little bit more about the perceived benefits of ISO 14067 as the go-to standard versus the others.
Sure, thank you for that question, Catherine. And I'll be speaking from more of an internal perspective, but I'll say this, the ISO 14067 standard came out in 2013, and it was fairly different from the GHG protocol in past 2050. There's some key differences, I'll say, back then, but it was updated in 2018. It's much closer in how it operates compared to the GHG protocol and past 2050 now. The reason why we like to use it internally, I'll say, is that we tend to find that it's clearer in its methodology, how it communicates the methodology and requirements. We like that there's flexibility in allowing for something in between a cradle to gate or a cradle to grave. So for example, if there's a life cycle stage outside of the cradle to gate, that's really important. But then there are others that are just not relevant. We have some flexibility there in how to do the modeling. And I'll also say that we like the approach for how it handles the variety of biogenic sources that are out there and removals, and how it requires those to be included in the total results, but then subdivided so it's very clear to see what type of emission is contributing to your total carbon impact. And one other reason I'll mention that we like using it is there are supporting standards attached to it that help just add to its value. So for example, some of the communication requirements that I was touching on, for example, the critical review process, there's a whole separate standard called ISO 14026 that merges, that works with 14067 to help provide additional guidance and clarification for how a carbon footprint should be communicated in a way that avoids confusion to customers or other businesses. So those are just a few reasons. And if Dave, if you'd like to add anything to that, let me know.
I think you covered it well, Ilan.
Great. Here's an interesting question. I have my own thoughts on this, but I'll let either Dave or Ilan chime in. Oh, and I should introduce Dave. Dave is the program manager for our carbon services division. So he's sitting in to answer questions in harmony with the rest of our team. But are you able to provide the comparative data set of where a product falls relative to other products in the category? And like I say, I have my own thoughts on that, but Dave, I don't know, or Ilan?
Dave, let me know if I'm happy to take this, but let me know if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead and start on that.
Great. So I'll say this, if you're interested in making any kind of comparative claim, so you want to communicate to anyone outside your organization that your product is better from a carbon footprint standard than another product, let's say it's 10% lower or 20% lower, anything that's a comparative claim like that does require a slightly more rigorous comparative carbon product footprint and does require this external critical review process. However, if you're just interested in kind of benchmarking and getting an idea internally, like where do we fall in the broader landscape? Well, we can use these large databases that are out there like EcoInvent to look at representative products within your market. So for example, within a certain country or within a region like Europe or Asia or North America. And what we can do is benchmark your product's carbon impact against those. Now, you wouldn't be able to make comparative claims with that information, but internally, if you just wanted to see how are we kind of stacking up in the broader scale, that's absolutely something we can do.
Interesting. I'd also say that there are tools like, for instance, in the building materials sector, the EC3 tool is sort of showing different building materials, but those are not 14067 compliant. It's just comparing the EPD value for GWP. And then as more people publish carbon footprints, I would think that would be also a way to kind of compare.
You're absolutely right, Karen, and that's a good point to clarify. We have these databases and we could use them, but we're happy to look at anything that's publicly available. The caveat being, we're of course gonna limit the conclusions you can draw if the calculations were done using a different standard or using a different set of global warming potentials.
Right.
So 14067 uses the most recent IPCC global warming potentials. Right now, that's the AR6 2021 emission factors, but older ones out there, we'll provide that limitation. That'll be a detailed conversation we have with you. But all that to say, yes, we can do benchmarking of publicly available data or proprietary data that's provided in a database like EcoInvent.
Okay, great. Kelly, here's a CBAM question. I don't know if you can answer this, but it says, can you clarify 20% allowance in CBAM? Should the 20% be from default values or primary?
Sure, I can clarify that. So the 20% will be the upper limit on default values where primary data could be used instead and is preferred. So when that limit goes into effect, the manufacturer will be required to go to their suppliers and get primary data from them covering at least 80% of the emissions of the good that they're making.
Gotcha. And I have a follow-on question. Can you give an example of a precursor material that's covered, like a
Sure.
industry example, like I'm making screws and, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So so in the iron and steel sector, you'll have a ton of just steel products. So the input to your screw, whatever type of piece of steel it is, that would be covered. And if the majority of the emissions from making the screw happen at the previous step in the supply chain, that would be a case where you need to get primary data from that supplier.
Gotcha. Great. Dave or Elon, maybe this is a good question for one of you. What's the best way to get started with product carbon footprints?
Elon, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, I'd say the best way to get started would be to reach out to a sales rep on our team. Karen, do we have contact information on this presentation?
Yeah, I actually will go to the next slide. But I also would say sometimes as someone, I'm fully in marketing now, but as someone that's fielded that question, I think, if you don't want to start with your whole product portfolio, sometimes people start with the product that's either their best seller or the one that they're, being asked for that information the most, or so sometimes, it can be like a volume type of place to, start the process. But if you have other thoughts on that, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think thinking strategically about your need, as Karen mentioned, whether that's for marketing purposes because you have a product that is just really big in a certain marketplace or very important for your company, or you're getting a lot of questions about it, that's a great place to start. And, if you're not sure where to start, or you think, you have an idea, but you want to talk to someone about it, that's what we're here for. So we have sales reps, myself, Dave, we can get involved as well to help answer questions that are more technical in nature. But that's part of the scoping process, is we will meet with you and talk about, so we can understand what your needs are and how we can best serve them and make sure that the data is available and the scope that we think matches. But we're happy to help you in that process.
Right. And here's a really good question, and I think it's a really good question. Is it possible to develop a footprint that satisfies CBAM and general customer footprint inquiries? And I think what's interesting about that question is once you're in the process, that it makes a lot of sense to be able to kind of address both. But from a technical standpoint, I don't know, Kelly or Elon, if you have more to say about that.
Sure, I could start on that one. So as far as customer footprint inquiries, for customers inside the EU, they're going to be really interested in the CBAM embedded emissions because they're required to report it. So that will be useful for that. But as far as giving that number to different customers, I guess it depends on their priorities, but the footprint itself, whether it complies with, say, ISO versus complying with CBAM, the results will be different. One, because it's split between direct and indirect, so that's like a tangible difference, but just the factors that need to be used will lead to slightly different results. The good thing is that a lot of the same data needs to be collected, and that's kind of the heaviest lift on the customer side. So we could use the same primary data from the operation to get to both results.
Right. I would definitely say if you're going to be if you fall under CBAM requirements at all, that doing both at the same time would make the most sense.
Absolutely. And for the exact same reason Kelly mentioned, the hardest part, the most time sensitive, energy intensive for our clients tends to be the data collection. So once we have that data validated and well understood, it saves a lot of time on both our end and your end to then remodel it so that it matches a different standard.
There was a question about what type of primary data, and I believe that was covered by you, Elon. Just the kind of like, what are the process emissions? What you can go into that, you can recap that list a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll say that primary data ideally is going to be available for all of the raw materials that are involved in your product. So all the different components, right? There should be a detailed bill of materials so that we know what's in there. If you know what the recycled contents are of those materials, it's also very helpful to have that as primary data. And then all the manufacturing impacts as well. So the energy intensity, if water is being used, the waste that's being generated, those are key points to have. But I'll say this, often our clients, they don't have sub-meters on individual manufacturing lines within a facility. They might only have utility bill for that entire facility. And same for water, for waste generation. And so something that's really cool about all of these standards is that they allow for something called allocation. And what we're going to do is work with you to find a way to allocate the energy usage, the water usage, the waste generation from the facility level and allocate that down just to the product that we're interested in. There are different ways to do that. And one of them might be a mass base. So, what percentage of that, of your total manufacturing does this product represent? If that's not a great way to do it, we can talk to a manufacturing facility manager to get some other ideas. We can even use economic allocation, although that tends to make less sense. But sometimes it's a more viable way to do it. So we have different ways, and depending on your intention for the project, that can also change our data requirements. So for instance, if you want to use this kind of external communication, then we're going to be more stringent on making sure that we have good primary data for the raw materials in your manufacturing processes, for instance. But if it's more for a benchmarking, a prospective study, something like that, then we have a bit more flexibility and can use peer-reviewed research. We can look into different databases, look at proprietary databases, and try to create something that, in conversation with you, we think is going to be a really close fit to what's actually happening. So there is flexibility there, and that flexibility just depends on the intention. So I hope that answered your question.
Great. And I'll just add that there was a question about field audit. This is all a desk audit activity. It's all electronic collection of data and whatnot like that. The very last question I'll throw over to you, Dave, and that is, we use carbon footprints to be able to quantify the carbon intensity of a given product and then sometimes move forward with a carbon neutral certification. And I just want to ask you, what value a carbon neutral certification has for products in the marketplace. I mean, we've seen recently that Apple has produced carbon neutral, what they call the Apple Watch. And there are a lot of technology products now on the market that are considered carbon neutral, and just sort of what the value of that is from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karen. And that's a great question. So much like a corporate or company level carbon neutrality claim, you can also make a carbon neutrality claim for your products, and its process is very similar. And there's been a lot of press lately, mainly in Europe, as to carbon neutrality, carbon neutral claims, but there's still a lot of benefits to having a carbon neutral product. One of the things, if you're certifying to a carbon neutral standard, is that those standards after the initial certification are going to require you to look at your product, look at your manufacturing process, your supply chain, and work to reduce your emissions. So you have to be able to show greenhouse gas reductions in subsequent years after the initial certification in order to get recertified. So it does force you to look at your material selections, your design decisions and things like that in the product in order to, and supply chain, in order to show those reductions to be recertified. There's also a benefit, and I think a lot of that negative press around carbon neutral claims is really geared more towards the offsets used to become carbon neutral, but there are some excellent high quality offsets out there that have a real positive benefit from a social aspect that you can purchase to offset your footprint and become carbon neutral. So there's a social benefit to being certified and using those offsets as well. And then just a marketing claim or a marketing value that to be able to claim that your product is carbon neutral, there's certainly a marketing benefit as well.
I would agree. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Again, we will be sending the recording, and we appreciate your attention today, and we look forward to seeing you on another webinar soon. Thanks to all of our presenters. We wish you a great day.